Good evening, everyone. It's now 5 o'clock, and I call this workshop of the Victoria City Council to order. Our workshops are informal, and with that, we'll dive right into our agenda. The first item on the agenda tonight is our item to discuss a draft predatory offender ordinance. Ms. Hardy, do you want to kick us off with that?
You can do that, Mayor. Good evening, Mayor, members of the council. As you know, we held a public hearing to garner feedback and public input from our residents on specific changes that they would like to see to our residency restrictions ordinance, Ordinance 414, related to predatory offenders. After that hearing, and all the public comments were received, council direction was to work with our city attorney to draft a revision or draft revisions to Ordinance 414 that reflected the proposed changes of the Keep Victoria Kids Safe Policy Committee, and that also included protections for vulnerable adults. And so this evening, staff will present those revisions, and we'll be seeking council direction on next steps. Rather than a PowerPoint this evening, we thought it would the cleanest and easiest way to walk council and the residents who are watching us this evening would be to show the red lines. And so our Community Economic Development Director, Marty Dahl, will be walking us through the red line revisions. But before I pass the baton over to Marty, I just want to note that city staff reviewed the modifications and kept in contact with our residents that are representing that policy committee. So we were pretty much, I think it's safe to say we were pretty much lockstep in sync in terms of the revisions that and some minor modifications that we recommended to what they had proposed to make sure that they were in the loop on that and that we're on the same page. So I don't want to speak on behalf of them today, but we feel that the draft ordinance that we're presenting here this evening reflects the collective thoughts of both the resident group and staff's thoughts and reflect council direction. So with that, I'll pass it over to Marty to walk us through those changes. Feel free to have this we want this to be interactive. Feel free to ask questions along the way, and then we'll come back for a discussion and get some clear direction from you on next steps.
Sounds great. Thank you. Mr. Dahl, why don't you lead us through the redlined version of this?
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. Yes, I'll echo everything that Dana said. So I don't think my presentation will be very long this evening, but did want to just walk through a couple of things, items of note. So first, as was included in your background packet, just want to note the items that were of significant change from the original Ordinance 414, just so it is noted by council what was previously included and will not be or has been modified. So the purpose section in this revised ordinance has been revised to provide more clarity as to what the purpose of the ordinance is. You will see new definitions added for designated level 1 or level 2 predatory offenders, level 3 predatory offenders, designated offense, neighborhood amenity, designated vulnerable adult housing, and vulnerable adult. Those are all new definitions. We have revised the definitions for licensed child care facility and public park or playground. There has been an addition of buffer zones for level 1 and level 2 offenders. That was something the old ordinance did not address. There has been an increase in certain buffer zones for level 3 offenders. There have been added buffer zones for vulnerable adult housing as well as for neighborhood amenities such as HOA pools and private parks. There has been a removal of the exception allowing an offender who is granted a risk level reduction, the ability to live in these buffer areas. It has also removed the exception allowing an offender to live with parents, grandparents, siblings, spouse, or adult children within those buffer areas. There has been a revised exceptions that will not allow an offender to live in the same house as a previous victim, even if they are a minor or meet any of the other exceptions to the ordinance. And then a section has been added speaking to prohibited activities that would not allow offenders to attend events meant for or including children and vulnerable adults. So those are the highlights of the changes from the existing ordinance 414. So then moving into the draft red line version of the ordinance, what staff did was use the ordinance that was provided by the Keep Victoria Kids Safe group and then has redlined that language. So this was also included in your background packet. So you'll see we added an additional line to the purpose, which was actually a suggestion from the Resident Policy Committee on including as part of that purpose that this ordinance is meant to stop those offenders from participating in events designed for or involving children or vulnerable adults. Under definitions, this is just some standard boilerplate language that was added to note that if it is not defined, it will be the use of common language. We did suggest that the definition for designated predatory offender be changed to designated level 1 or level 2 predatory offender, just to again provide some clarity within the ordinance when we are speaking to those buffer zones. So you'll see as we go through, there is one set of buffers for level 1 or level 2 offenders and another set of buffers for level 3 offenders. We did have some adjustment to the designated offense definition. This was through conversation with legal counsel, just related to the section of admission of guilt under oath without adjudication. That one, I think we had determined, at least legally, would be pretty hard to enforce, either from a city level or from a sheriff's level. And how is that admission of guilt without any adjudication? Sorry about that. Actually taking place. So we have suggested striking that language. We also had suggested revising the definition for neighborhood pool to be neighborhood amenity, just to incorporate more of those HOA type areas, clubhouses, pools, private parks, etc. And we also included in the definition for public park or playground, play and athletic fields. So moving down, again, you'll just see some minor verbiage changes here based on that definition change for the level 1 or level 2 buffer zones. We are looking at, for most of those areas, a 1,600 foot buffer with a 2,000 foot buffer between any other permanent residency from a predatory offender. In addition, staff and based on council direction also included a buffer for dedicated vulnerable adult housing for level 1 and 2 offenders. And then for level 3 offenders, you can see that we are revising most everything to 2,000 feet for buffer, and that is an increase on many of those from the current ordinance 414. Moving down into the exceptions area, again, most of these edits were done just for clarity. I don't think anything changed significantly from the policy committee's draft, but again, amended to include the specific definition change for level 1 or 2, added in a tentative date of adoption that of course can be changed if that date changes. And then moving on to the other exceptions, we are looking at, again, just some rewording in here. This is related to that these offenders' residence cannot be the same residence as a previous victim resides. That is both for number 2 and number 3. And then moving down to prohibited activity, I know we had some discussion during the public hearing related to the specificity of the holiday event. So staff has suggested providing a bit more general prohibited activity definition or section about prohibited activities that would include but not be limited to holidays, events, activities, children's concerts, programs, youth sporting events, etc. And then other than that, I believe all of the penalty and severability language has remained the same. So with that, Mayor and members of the council, I will turn it back for you for discussion, and we can get a closer look at any of these sections if you wish.
Terrific. Thank you, Mr. Dahl. Council, questions?
I have questions.
Councilmember Black, let's start with you.
First, when I went through it, it didn't say anything about temporary residence. Should that be in there, or is that allowed?
I got
Mr.
people
Rose.
looking at me, so yeah, Mayor and Council, I'm not sure if I understand what you mean, Council Member. You mean, does
When
it
I was looking at all the other ordinances, they said temporary, they had a definition for temporary, which is under 14 days. and they had restrictions on temporary or permanent, and we just have permanent.
Yeah.
Should we add the temporary?
Well, I guess I'd look to staff a little bit on that. I guess my understanding is we're not making that distinction, and so these restrictions would apply to both. So in other words, it doesn't matter if it's you claim as the now released offender, if you claim that it's merely a temporary residence, that isn't an exception. That doesn't matter. You still have to comply with all of the ordinance requirements.
Okay, so.
Okay, it's unlawful, well, it's saying permanent residence on here. So I don't know, would they use that as a loophole? Is my question.
Where are you looking? I haven't memorized the ordinance changes, so help me.
Well, wherever it says permanent residence.
Scroll down again,
Oh, here, back up. 4, back up,
or 1.
right there. Permanent residence is a place where, is that what you're looking at, Judy?
Well, that's a definition, that's in definitions, but then when it has, in definitions, it doesn't say temporary. And then when you go down to the
He's highlighted.
designated level offenders and what they can and can't do, it says permanent residency.
Yeah, Mayor, council member, you're completely right, and I'm completely wrong. So you're right. That is the distinction that the ordinance makes. I managed to gloss over that. I guess I don't know the answer to the question. I don't know when the commissioner releases folks from the program. I don't know what provision they make for temporary residences. So as I sit here now, I guess I don't know the answer to that, whether that would be a loophole. But you're right, I'm not right. The ordinance does apply to permanent residences, so.
Right.
yeah.
Councilmember Black, Mayor, members of the council, I can just speak from a staff perspective. So we were using the version of the ordinance that was provided by the policy committee, which did not speak to the temporary residents in that draft. And I don't believe we were given any specific direction during our public hearing about working in temporary residents. That's not to say that that cannot be included if that's the council's prerogative, but that's the reason there's nothing in there currently.
Okay.
Mr. Dahl, can you tell us, was there anything about temporary residency in the previous ordinance?
I do not believe our previous ordinance discussed temporary residency as well, but I can confirm that here. No, the previous ordinance 414 only prohibited permanent residence.
Okay. All right, so that
Well,
would be
when
a
looking
consideration.
looking at other ordinances in other cities, it does specify that, and I would think that that would be an important factor to add in. Also, I had asked about not being able to live adjacent to children or a vulnerable adult, and that wasn't included. Was that a legal reason, or was it missed?
Yeah, Mayor, council, repeat the question, please. I'm sitting here pondering your temporary residence question, which is a good one, so I'll listen now to you again.
Okay. I had, at the last meeting, I had asked that we add where they cannot live adjacent to children or vulnerable adult, which I've seen in some ordinances, and I was wondering why that wasn't included.
Yeah, there's no, Mayor and council, there's no, I mean, the backdrop to all this, as you appreciate, because I know my colleague that was here at the hearing, and you've heard it now from me in a memo and in this memo, I mean, we're operating in a vacuum here, so there's no statutory direction on any of this stuff. And so I think that's a policy question. I mean, if you feel that there is a reason for imposing that restriction, there's no either grant of authority to do it or limitation on authority to do it. So I think it's a policy question.
The reason I asked to have that added was because we have a blanket area of 2,000 feet. If someone lives outside of that area, but they are placed with children or a vulnerable adult right next door, that's unsafe. So that's the reason I wanted to add that in there. Does anyone have any problem with that?
I'm wondering if we call out, so we call out facilities and neighborhood things, but we don't call out any kind of housing.
Right.
Or any, Is there a concern? Yeah, we don't, she's right, we don't call that out. Is there a concern about doing that? Mr. Bose?
Mayor and council,
Yeah.
I think the likelihood of a challenge, which of course is another part of the backdrop of what we're talking about here, probably does change a bit with that. I mean, because I think you're then talking about a situation where the city and/or the offender or the Department of Corrections, whoever would be sort of primarily evaluating residences, would have to inquire about where all of the children live in Victoria, I think, is what that would imply.
Well, before they would place them, they would have to find out if a child or a vulnerable adult lives next door, especially for a level 3.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you're concerned about them disagreeing with that, we could also have an appeal system set up for exemption and set up a residency board to go over that.
What if it's, sorry, Councilman, what if it's in reverse, right? Your situation where it's outside the 2,000 feet and there's a predator living there. Currently, the people next door move, a new family moves in.
But he lived there already, so that doesn't
So
count.
that,
Right.
okay.
That doesn't count. We're talking about where it happened in their neighborhood where they moved the predator right in and there's little girls right next door. And there's nothing that they can do about that. And they were already there. So that's what I'm talking about. But if the predator already lives there and they move out and the family moves in and they know that he's there, which they should be informed because real estate agents are required to do that, and they know that he lives there and they still move in, that's fine. It's just not putting him in there with people already there, with children or vulnerable adults already there.
It's hard for me because as much as it sounds great, like it's that risk assessment, right? Like, are we going from a 10% likelihood we get sued to 80, right? Like, and I don't know what the numbers are. I know you're not gonna be able to tell us what those numbers are, right? We're kind of making this up as we go along, right? But that's my concern, is that if we get too restrictive, we're gonna lose everything that we're really trying to do for what,
Yeah,
right?
and I understand that. That's why I thought maybe we could do, we could set up a system where there's an appeal for an exemption. And I've seen that in other areas where they've
In
done
other
that.
ordinances, you've seen that?
Yeah, they have it set up and they have an appeal for an exemption for a sex offender, and they have a residency board. This particular one had 3 citizens. One had a 1-year, one had a 2-year, one had a 3-year. And they take each case individually. So it's not like being blanketed on every single.
Mr. Bose,
Mayor,
what's the
if I could-
enforceability of that?
Yeah, I mean, the premise here of the restrictions, if you just look at the 2 paragraphs that deal with in 35-3, the 2 paragraphs that impose the restrictions, you would, I think, quickly note that the restrictions are from facilities, from particular uses of real estate, right? In other words, objectively identifiable uses of real estate. That is a school, there is a spacing requirement from a school. That is a library, there is a spacing requirement from the library. And these are knowable based on simply the land use that's objectively seeable. I think when we start to create a system where we have to start making inquiry into who lives in houses, it's just practically going to be a fair amount more difficult, of course. And I think just the risk of there being a challenge to that kind of a system, because, of course, ultimately, what that could lead to, in a theoretical way at least, is there is nowhere in Victoria where a person released could go. I mean, there are just too many kids based on that kind of a system, and you simply can't live here because there are no places, given the distribution of kids, there's nowhere where you can go. And I think that would be challenged if you had another situation arise where somebody is proposing to come here. I think that increases the likelihood of challenge. So do I know how that would actually play out 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now? I don't know. I don't know how kids are going to be distributed in your community. But that would be the difference with that kind of a restriction, is that it's based on who happens to be there at a given point in time. It's not based on the objective, what use is there.
Okay, well, the DOC does that. They look at the areas supposedly, and they decide.
Yep.
So
They
I
have-
think
they
we
have-
should have a voice.
But of course, Mayor and council member, not to belabor the point, but I mean, there's a fairly in-depth, lengthy statute that sets out their authority to do that, right? And the legislature has decided that the Department of Corrections will have the power to make that inquiry and make a decision about where these folks ought to go. So, and there is no such authority for cities.
Councilmember Black, anything else?
Okay, well, are we going to set up like a safety zone map so that people can see where that area is? Can we do that?
Say more about that. I don't understand what you're
A
asking.
safety zone map. So it says 1,600 feet or 2,000 feet, and have a map of the city, and it has circles so that,
Oh, I understand.
Councilmember Black, Mayor, members of the council, that would be relatively simple to do.
Okay, thank you.
yeah, okay.
All right. Councilmember Black, other questions?
Do we need to add loitering in there? I'm just worried about people coming in and hanging out.
Loitering?
Yeah.
Who would be loitering?
The sex offenders. When I read the report, it says, okay, they usually make a relationship with the person and then they offend. But then in another paragraph, it says, well, they usually go a mile or two away and they offend. So it's like a double-edged sword here. So I'm just worried about when a sex offender is roaming around and just hanging out and lurking. And I don't know if that belongs in here or if it just goes into another type of ordinance about loitering.
Well, Mayor and Council, I'm probably sort of repeating the same theme again. The again, premise of this ordinance is that the city would be restricting where folks can establish a residence, where they can live. I think the further we get into regulating or prohibiting conduct, where they can go, under what conditions they can go there, the further into a Department of Corrections authorized and required regulatory scheme we're going, right? The Department of Corrections in its release orders imposes all sorts of restrictions on these people. And then they have to monitor that, right?
Okay.
It's not local law enforcement alone that does that. It's the Department of Corrections that has the conditions on the release. I presume, I don't know, I have not carefully reviewed a release order, but there are restrictions on where these folks can go, for sure, and under what conditions they can go there. So to the extent we create new, different restrictions, I think that's maybe
Okay.
significantly increasing the difficulty and potential for litigation.
Okay. And then do we have a way to notify the property owners that rent so that they know that this ordinance is in effect once it is?
So, Councilmember Black, Mayor, members of the council, right now, we do not have a rental license program in Victoria, so we don't necessarily have a database of all of the facilities that, single-family facilities that would be renting their property out. So I don't know if we have that information currently available to us, but we can certainly see what we can come up with, either through utility bills or taxpayer identification or something, but I don't believe we
Are you asking, I'm sorry, are you asking so that the renter knows, so that they don't have a,
So that the landlord knows.
well, but the CD, or the, no, sorry, the
DOC.
the DOC would have to contact, right? Like, this would all be part of their release plan, so they're not just gonna let him into, or him or her into an apartment without letting the landlord, right? Like, I would assume, right? Like, they'd.
Would they? Okay. I just need to make sure because I saw it in an
Yeah, sure,
ordinance.
yep.
I've been going through
sure,
like
yep.
ordinances all over this country. So, all right, that's enough, that's enough.
Okay, you sure?
Yeah, well, for
We
now.
want to get the questions answered. All right.
Okay.
Other questions?
I do have one,
Councilmember Hebert.
as relates to vulnerable adults in the definition section. I know it has a attribute to the state of Minnesota. Just wondering if you look at the other definition, there's a little line or two in terms of what that means. Is it appropriate to have something there?
Definition.
I mean, not the whole, the statute from the state of Minnesota, but what does that mean at a high level? I don't know if that's something that we can summarize in a line or two, or is it, because there are different levels of vulnerability, does it just become too sticky to do that? Or does this cover it? It's more of a question, it's not necessarily an ask, but.
Yeah, Mayor, Councilmember, you're making a fair point about many of our ordinances, which is when is it appropriate for us to make reference to a state law or a state law definition as opposed to putting it right into our code so that it's more user-friendly for folks that read our code and to make sure that we agree with whatever state definition. I would be way out over my skis if I tried to explain to you what this definition means and what it collects and what it doesn't collect. I'm not familiar enough with the definition, but it's a totally legitimate point. We can certainly, staff can certainly take a look at that definition and make sure that it's sort of, that you understand what it is and that we all agree that that's the right, appropriate way to define the folks we're trying to protect.
I would agree with that. There is some concern that, I could designate myself a vulnerable adult because I didn't want to live next door. And I could probably come up with somebody who would indeed say, yes, you are vulnerable. So, I think there should be some kind of boundary around that or definition.
Yeah, just some definition, again, not the whole statute, but something that a user, when they're looking at the ordinance, right, how likely are they gonna go to section 626.5572 to find out what that means?
Yeah, some ordinances actually listed all those in the definitions, all those numbers, and they listed them.
Or do we have could we have a link where, it has a hyperlink and it takes you right to that particular section and describes what that is?
We do have the ability to do that, and we do have some of our code sections that have a reference section that then just provides the hyperlinks. The problem is that those links do sometimes change.
Sure.
Usually we don't know that they're broken until someone clicks on it and lets us know, but yeah, we do have the ability to do that.
But I still would like to, if we're completely up to me, I would like to have some sort of a
I think to the
brief
extent,
definition.
right, I think to the extent that we're using some other definition, someone else's definition, and we're not creating our own definition, that feels to me like it's a better solution than to say, here's what we think. Okay. Councilmember Hebert, anything else?
Nope, that's the only.
Councilmember Roberts, questions?
Yeah, I got a few things. First of all, I obviously was not here at the special meeting, but thank you. So just thank you to the Keep Victoria Kids Safe group for your presentation and all the hard work into that. And thank you to the other council members for asking all the tough questions. So I knew you guys were in capable hands, so that's why I was okay not being here. So just a couple of things. So the removal of the exception, allowing the offender to live with parents, grandparents, etc. That's just we're not saying they can't live with them. It's just that's not the workaround to get into the boundaries that we've given up, correct? Or that
That's
we've set,
correct.
right?
It would, Councilmember Roberts, Mayor, members of the council, that would not allow them to use that as an exception to
Yep.
live in the buffer.
Yep.
And it also would not apply to any minors or any, those that offended as a minor because they are already accepted through that exception.
Okay. I know you've talked about how we're in gray area of enforceability and stuff like this anyways, but I guess my question is so we have something in there about not allowing an offender to live in the same home as a victim. On the surface, obviously, that sounds great. I know, in fact, that we have residents in this that's going on. Can we legally actually say, like, if the family welcomes, the offender back who, offended someone in that home, can we actually do that? And does this create a potential big legal issue?
Yeah. Well, Mayor, Council, I don't want to keep punting, but on the first part, the legal part, I just have to say again, I mean, we're operating in a zone where the legislature, you can hear my
Yeah,
frustration
yep,
a little bit, but the
yep.
legislature here has had this issue now for 7 years, 8 years, and just has not made a clear decision. And for the benefit of the public, this is not an area where sometimes the legislature says, cities, you may not do the following thing.
Yep.
You are not going to have authority over this area, and makes it very clear. And sometimes the legislature says, cities, you do have authority. In cases like this where they've said nothing about city authority and have granted very, very strong authority to a state department, a Department of Corrections, there isn't a legal argument about that implies that cities don't have that authority. But I can't tell you that that's in fact the way a court would rule. Sure. So, but we're operating in a vacuum because of that. I mean, there just isn't any statutory authority on that. To your point, though, about practically, I mean, you're exactly right. If you know, I don't know because I haven't spent enough time. This isn't what city attorneys do typically, of course. I don't know the situation in which the Department of Corrections might allow the release of a person from the program and allow that person to reside immediately as their residents coming out of the program with a victim of whatever has occurred, right? I don't know if that circumstance is even theoretically possible, if the department would ever allow that to occur. But I do know that the department has the authority to address that question, right? I mean, they clearly have the authority to evaluate whether an offender who's being released can live with the victim. I mean, that's as clear as day. So, so I think that a city then stepping in and saying, we don't care if the department has concluded that's okay, we're not going to let that happen. I think that's significantly, again, increases the chances for a challenge. I think that's right. But my understanding was from the resident group and from the feedback from the council was that is a circumstance that we're not going to tolerate. And even though it may increase the risk, that's we're not going to have that happen.
Sure.
So
just be clear.
Sorry to give you that answer, but I mean that's
like I'm fine with the thing, right? I just wanted more right, your opinion and more information on that. So if we were to be sued, and I guess I don't know if this is a question for you, Dana or Marty, right? Obviously, we have insurance. Like, what does insurance typically cover? Right? Obviously, money isn't the most important thing here, but it is a factor, right? So, I mean, do they cover most of it? Do they, like, if we saw the one, right? It was $70,000. Like, do we know like how much insurance typically covers in such like lawsuits like that?
Yeah, so Mayor and Council, again, details always matter, and so we're kind of, hypothetically talking, but, as a general matter, a claim arising out of this kind of statutory scheme, this kind of a local ordinance, there would be insurance as a general matter for a claim arising out of that, and the defense that you get, the insurance coverage that you get includes legal defense costs, a significant percentage of those costs. And then typically does not include a damage award. So to the extent the city would settle or would get judged having to pay damages, that's typically not covered by insurance.
Okay. Let's see here. Sorry,
We could take donations.
I guess my only other concern, right? So obviously, personally, right, we'd obviously like to make it as restrictive as possible, right? But we do have to think about other things and make sure that we're not too restrictive so we don't lose what we want to get accomplished here. Yeah, I mean, part of my concern is, right, is that, I know, right, I think we've seen a few lawsuits out of I think we've said 100 cities that have had ordinances or so, which isn't a lot. But I feel like Victoria's gotten in the limelight a little bit here, right? And we're seeing this, and my concern is that we've been in the paper, we've been in the news. There's definitely going to be groups out there that are looking at these things, and I hope that we're not too restrictive, that they're right, like they're just going to come after us because they want to make an example out of us. So that's just my only concern. I just, right, like in general, like I have no problems with any of this ordinance. I just want us to think about, right, really carefully about not being too restrictive or adding things to be too restrictive so that we push it over that edge and we lose what I think all of us want, right? So it's not that I'm against it. It's like I just want us to be careful.
Yeah. Councilmember
we are in a
Roberts, I
gray
would agree
area.
with you completely. I mean, it is the council's responsibility to protect us from lawsuits and make sure that what we've got going on is practical, enforceable, and does what we need it to do. And that's a concern, and it's a valid concern, and I think we all feel that up here as well. So, don't apologize for it, because it is our responsibility. We do have fiduciary responsibility to the city, and that's a big part of it.
And I think some people, right, like people see a $70,000 and it's like, well, that's not that much. But when you have as small of a budget as we have, I mean, that can be crippling to a city, right? So those are just things we have to consider.
Absolutely. Anything else, Councilmember Roberts?
No.
Okay, I have a couple of questions for you, and I think the attorney here is going to be back in the hot seat on these things. Level,
the hot seat yet?
no, not yet. Level 1 and level 2, we call that out specifically, and there is no notification requirement from the department for level 1 and level 2. Kind of going along that same theme of, does this open us up and make us more vulnerable to a lawsuit by calling out level 1 and level 2?
Yeah, Mayor and Council, that was my initial reaction as well. I know that was a recommendation, though, out of the committee. Recommendation out of the committee, and I think there are some other ordinances out there that make that distinction and impose those restrictions, and I understood that. So I share your concern, I guess is what I'm saying, Mayor. That said, I understood that there was a desire by the group to make sure that we're being as on top of this, for lack of a better word, as we can be, and imposing restrictions on all level offenders. So I can't speak to the sort of the merits of that, right? The rationale behind that, but I share the concern that, level 1 designated offenders can involve offenses that are relative to the offenses that we're aware of now from the most recent occurrences are much less significant offenses. So you're right. I mean, I don't know what to say other than I share the concern.
Right, so theoretically, we don't know who the level 1 and level 2 offenders are. However, the sheriff's department does know. So is it the onus on the sheriff's department to enforce that ordinance?
Yes.
Yes. And what is the, if they don't, or if they choose not to enforce, what's the repercussion of that?
Yeah. Well, Mayor and Council, I mean, this is almost a caveat, opportunity for a caveat, but I'll take it. Anyway, because of our local law enforcement arrangement, we use the sheriff's department. Obviously, many cities have their own police departments. Because of that, essentially our relationship to the sheriff is contractual. We contract with the sheriff to provide local law enforcement services, and so much of what your question was about is really tied up in that contract. What authority does the city council have to dictate, for example, law enforcement priorities to the sheriff's department? We would like you to focus less on traffic offenses and more on, shoplifting. Obviously, if it's your police department, you have a much more direct route to have that conversation. But you have some ability under the contract, as I understand it, to still have that conversation. But ultimately, I think the sheriff would say, in many of the cities that I work with, the sheriff's department serves as local law enforcement, and the sheriff's department can't have its policies countywide change from city to city. I mean, they're going to have their county law enforcement policy, and they're going to enforce laws as they do in all of the areas. Because, of course, some of the time the county sheriff is in a city, whether it's acting as the local law enforcement or just acting as the county sheriff, right? And so they follow their own policies to a large extent. So I realize that's an evasive way of answering your question, but I think the reality is it's a good question. It's dictated by the contract, and ultimately I think you would find that the county is going to be a little bit resistant to the city saying, do this more, do this less, do this way. I mean, they have their own protocols.
One of the things that also in this ordinance, we've got the Department of Justice, who we've learned has a lot of authority and a lot of flexibility. And we're trying to put a block on some of that. And so the legal question here then would be, at the end of the day, does the Department of Justice trump the City of Victoria's ordinance when it comes to any of these things? So, so we can put this ordinance in place, and they have chosen to locate somebody within the restrictions that we've laid out, and they've said, we understand that these are restrictions, we understand it's not in compliance with your ordinance, but we're gonna go ahead and do it anyway because we feel like this is a good placement.
Yeah. Mayor and council, I think Department of Corrections, I think is what you're referring to.
Oh, did I say Department of Justice?
Yeah, but I understand.
Sorry,
I think
yeah.
I understand what you're saying. Fifth time I've gotten to jump around the question, but I don't know how to answer it perfectly directly. I think that the fairest answer is nobody yet knows the answer to that. That question is really another way of asking the question, do cities have any statutory authority to adopt these kind of ordinances, or don't they? And that's an unresolved question. Again, I am frustrated as a city attorney in this city and other cities that the legislature hasn't made any attempt to answer that question. But regardless of my personal frustration about that, it's an unresolved question. There are a couple of district court decisions that find that cities do not have any authority in this area. But there have been no Court of Appeals decisions, no appellate court decisions that reach that conclusion. And so there is no answer to that question yet. But that's the question, and that you've asked it another way, which is, do the department's statutory authorities and their regulations that they've adopted under that statute, do they trump, do they preempt anything a city does, or can the city have its own requirements, its own restrictions? That is the question. So I don't know the answer.
And isn't that what the task force being put together is for?
It is.
So we could eventually get those answers, but in the meantime, I'm thinking this is best we can do with what we have.
Well, I'm thinking back to our conversation with the commissioner and our request to have him review the placement. And, we measured it, it's within those buffer zones. And the commissioner came back and said, we're not gonna move, we're gonna leave him here because we feel like this is the best placement. So while I'm all in favor of this, I don't want us to not be aware that all the things that we're doing might not work,
Yeah.
might not have the same effect. And I'm all for trying, but I think we really need to be clear about the fact that this is, the way things are set up today and the way things are now, and we can hope for change and we can work on it, and we are. But I think we need to be really clear about the fact that this may not do what we think it's going to.
Yeah, and Mayor, and I don't want to belabor the point, but you're making a very good point, and that is that I understand there is a task force, and you're going to have some representation there, and I think that's very good. I mean, I think a way to express the concern you've got is that right now the Department of Corrections is not advocating for or against local restrictions on these folks, right? They have not taken a strong, clear position on cities do or don't have this authority. They've raised a question. Their representative is quoted in an article about our situation, raising the question about local
And they're
authority.
frustrated as well.
Yep, but they have not advocated. So, but is it possible that they may take a position down the road if the legislature doesn't step in and sort of do, for the colloquial way, do its job and clarify this? Yeah, I think the department may do that at some point, and they may, well, Mayor, to your point, say, we can't have competing levels of regulation of these folks. We have to have a statewide system for doing it, and it's us that does it, and you cities can't do this anymore. That is a possible result of where things are headed.
Okay. I have one other kind of question that I want to ask. So these offenders come out and they have conditions of release.
Yes.
And we are trying to also legislate some conditions of release within our ordinance here. I guess my question is, at what point, and it's probably the same answer that you've been giving us, is it's not clear.
Yeah.
Can we say, you've got all these restrictions on these people and we're going to pile 2 more on top of that or 3 more on top of that? And at what point, or what's the negotiation with the Department of Corrections to say, this is what works for us as a community?
Yeah, and Mayor, and Council, I had said before that I I have not carefully evaluated a whole bunch of example orders for release, but my understanding is, and I have looked at some, is that, as making the distinction between a residency restriction and then sort of a behavioral or a moving about type of restriction, much of those orders relates to your conduct, relates to your behavior as a person released from the program. So yes, one of the things the department does is they establish where you can and can't live. They have that authority, and that's part of course, as you are well aware now, part of what they review. But you're right, the order has a whole bunch of restrictions theoretically on where the person can go, under what conditions. Do I have to tell my, we used to say parole officer, I'm not sure what the term of art is today, but how much do I have to report in, and do I have to have monitoring? And so and all of that is spelled out in the order, and I am fairly sure, again, this is speculative, but I'm fairly confident that to the extent a city starts to move away from just where can you live in my city into where can you go in our city and under what conditions and et cetera, that is going to be more encroaching on the department's role and the department's orders than just the residency stuff that we've been talking about. So I think your ordinance, as most or all ordinances that I've seen, focusing on residency is probably the least offensive to the department's authority over conduct and behavior of the folks that have been released.
All right.
I have a couple more, just two more questions, sorry.
Councilmember Roberts, no. We need to be thorough.
So I know, right, so we know the legislature was looking at this, right? They didn't pass a bill. I don't know exactly what was in there. Do we know whether that bill or, I know the committee and other stuff, right? They're hoping that they'll get something done. Was the point of that, would that have given more clarification on if cities have the authority or do not have the authority? Or do we know exactly how that what it would have done?
Mayor and Council, I don't know the particular proposal that you're talking about. I mean, I know historically, though, about how we sort of got here was that the program in Minnesota back, I'm going to get the number of years, but you know what I'm talking about, 7 years ago when a federal court decision came out, in that the program resulted in indefinite confinement of folks after they'd served their criminal conviction. And in some cases, they were indefinitely confined in the couple of facilities that we have. And that was ruled unconstitutional. You can't, on top of your criminal punishment, then be, in effect, punished through the commitment process. And in response to that, in the response to the law being ruled unconstitutional, that was the impetus for many cities to start adopting these kind of restrictions. There were some cities that had them before, but many more cities adopted these kind of restrictions when the law was ruled unconstitutional. I don't know, I have not heard, quite candidly, that the legislature was interested in clarifying that authority. I have not heard that being the focus of the issue. Rather, it's been more about how do we make the program, the statutory scheme, constitutional? How do we protect the statutory scheme from challenges that it's unconstitutional because people are put away forever? So, but maybe Victoria is helping. We're at the pointy end of the spear here a little bit on maybe the legislature needs to take a look at the fact that there are, in excess of 100 cities that are sufficiently concerned about this to have done something about it. And is that appropriate or not? Is that state policy or not? If the state wants to have a policy that cities should have no role in this, the state legislature can and does all the time say that to cities. So it would be useful to know.
Yeah.
And then my last question is, so going back to potential lawsuits, so whether we went to trial, right, and lost, if we lost, does it invalidate our entire ordinance or just the section that they sued on?
Yeah. Mayor and Council, I think I've, in a separate memo that's sort of partially parroted here in the public memo before you, I pointed out, and I think it points it out in the staff memo as well, that there's sort of two lines of challenge to these ordinances that we've seen appear. One is that the way this ordinance affects me as a party that's been released is unconstitutional. You're restricting, my civil rights have been restored. You're unconstitutionally impacting my civil rights. And that's one line of challenge. And that line of challenge could result in just a part of an ordinance being struck. the restriction that affects me is the following: 2,000 feet from the school, I want to live 1,800 feet from the school, you're unconstitutionally infringing, and that provision is what's at issue. The concern I've got, the bigger concern I've got, is what I've been saying a couple of times here tonight, which is just that we're in a vacuum. There is no clear statutory authority in this area. And a challenge on that ground would just be a challenge that says, it doesn't matter actually what Victoria said. There is no authority for them in this area. We're challenging the entire ordinance. The entire ordinance scheme is not authorized by law, and so the entire ordinance should be struck. And that has occurred in a couple of cases. So it depends is the answer, but you know, there is a way that it could just be a partial striking of part of your code, and it could be you know, striking the whole ordinance.
I don't have any other questions.
Okay. All right, council, we need to give some direction to staff here. Clearly I have heartburn with this. I have a heartburn with this because it feels really, puts us out there. It really does. It puts a target on our back and it puts us out there. So I have some heartburn about this. What I'm trying to work on is, you know, could I take some Pepto-Bismol and be okay with it and take the risk? Or is there a way we should peel this back so the target is at least smaller and not quite so big? And I think from my perspective, the level 1 and level 2 thing is a concern for me because there's a lot of them out there. And if we've got some folks who want to take issue with us, now we've opened up that pool of people wider to not just level 3 offenders, but now level 1 and level 2. So that feels like it could be pared back. I don't know if that's if that protects us or doesn't against the things that people are already using. So, you know, I would like to wrap the whole city up, but we can't do it. We can't do it. And I'm trying to get to a place that feels a little better.
Do we want to hear from our residents before we decide?
How do you guys feel? Do you have something to add, or? I mean, happy to have you comment if you. Sherry, why don't you come on up to the microphone,
come to the
please,
microphone,
so we
sorry.
can hear. You know what? I know we've got another item to get to on our workshop, so I'm going to ask you to be as succinct as possible.
Mayor, council members, we understand and share the notion of
Before we get started, could I get your name and address for the record?
Sherry
Thank you.
Woods Drive. Good. So our original concerns were to be defensible, and we talked about this last time, and I think our understanding of adjacency was that that was a limiter, and that we understood where precedent had been set in other counties, and we understood, Councilmember Black, why you felt the way you did as we do, but we also felt like adjacency was one that made us almost unable to have anybody live anywhere in Victoria. So we had that discussion in balance.
Okay.
The 1-2 does exist, and there is also the notion of preemption from the Dayton case that we understand is forthcoming, and have been working with Coleman and others on what would that look like. So we agree on all fronts. We hear you.
Yep.
I guess if there was one that we felt was worth taking a risk, the same home is the one we think is worth taking. You know, that's one that we feel pretty strongly about, as well as level 1 and 2. The challenge is the DOC doesn't always make those placements. They're not always done by the DOC. So then what? So that becomes a question that falls outside of that. So that was the third one. And then as far as the temporary and permanent, we would agree with you on the temporary and permanent, that temporary, because if you look at some of the language, we assumed it was under 14 days, over 14 days, but Laura can speak better to it. It's actually in aggregate, in a calendar year, 14 days. So you could have 3 days, 3 days, 4 days, 1 day. And that, in essence, prevents the couch surfing and the moving around. And that is why we would like that to be identified. So I'll let Laura speak to some of the things that she.
Can I ask a question quick on that? So it seems like the temporary wouldn't probably be as big of an issue with the level 3 because the DOC, because they indicated from their meetings that they tend to not want, right? Like they didn't want to do hotels because it's harder to control the area, right? But the 1 to 2, that might be the bigger issue with?
Well, but the 3, the placement itself is fluid. That's the problem that they have with it. And so that's where inside a calendar year, 3 years on this couch, 2 days on this couch, 4 days on this couch, which is why we would like it in, because it has a broader window. It's beyond the placement side of things. It's when you're trying to keep track of somebody over the course of a calendar.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Laura Maurer with Circle, Victoria. I'll just speak to the temporary residence since that's what we're talking about right now. If you want to look, I was just researching it right now while you guys brought it up. So Coon Rapids, it looks like they have one, Chapter 8, 1700, so 8-1700. And the way it is explained is it's 14 or more days in the aggregate, like Sherry was saying, in the calendar year. So that does make sense. You know, it isn't just saying, okay, you're visiting for 5 days, you're part of the temporary, you're out. It is 14 days or more over that full year. So that does make sense because you are basically making that into a permanent residence, just couch surfing, doing that. And then it also had 1, 2 for 4 days if within 1 month. So that also makes sense as well. So it is one that you guys could look at. I would like to also, because one that's really important to our community is the level 1, level 2. It is really, really important. If you feel like it makes you a target, maybe we could talk more about maybe removing level 1. But the research that I've been doing, or if you even look at the Minnesota legislative findings from 2003, which was on a study from 1997 to 1999, a lot of those who are reoffending may have been level 1, level 2, and they never go to civil commitment because there really isn't an option for civil commitment, and they're the ones who are doing the worst as well. So to pull that out of our ordinance, the way it's drafted as the red line right now, would be very disheartening because we have to think back to who is actually being leveled. It's people who, the majority of these sexual predators aren't even being leveled. You have a ton of them not even being leveled. They're not even in prison. So you're reaching these new thresholds in our state because our state is not protecting our children. And yes, we're taking that off, with Senator Coleman at the state level as well. So as a city, we have to protect our children as much as possible, and keeping level 1 and level 2 is critical for that piece of it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Ms. Hardy, please.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. Just a quick note on temporary residence. Of the 29 ordinances that staff conducted some research on, 25 of the 29 do define temporary residence as part of their residency restriction ordinance.
Okay, thank you. All right. So, council, how do you feel about temporary? How do you feel about level 1, level 2? How do you feel about adjacency? We need to provide some direction for staff so we can make the changes. Councilmember Roberts.
I don't think the adjacency should be in. I just think with as many kids as there, like, we're basically saying you can't live in Victoria. And I understand why you want to.
Yeah.
It would be great if we could, but I don't want us to lose.
Well, I'm willing to forego that for now and then see where we get with the state, as long as we can keep 1 and 2 and put in the temporary.
Okay, very good.
I would be okay with that.
Okay,
You guys okay?
okay.
All right.
Ms. Hardy, you good? Mr. Dahl? Got that for direction? Okay, very good. We're
right.
nodding our heads here and know that you have advocates at the state level to fix this thing. And we know it, and there's a bunch of people out there who are in the same position we are, and they are advocates as well. So I think we need to continue to push back on the state to get this thing resolved. Okay.
Agreed.
Very good.
Okay.
Nothing else. We're going to move on to our next agenda item. It's to discuss our facility space needs. Again, thank you to you folks very much. Our facility space needs recommendations and findings. Mr. Shoger, you're going to start us off with that, so.
Good evening, and thank you, Mayor and Council. Tonight, we will be,
We're keeping it. Sorry.
we good? No, you're no problem. Tonight, we'll be reviewing the second round of our space needs assessment presentation, including revisions and staff recommendations. John McNamara and Melissa Stein from WALD will be presenting, as well as the content and context added by staff, as well as Andrew, specifically Chief Hager. So if there are any questions, we'd love to take them, maybe after the presentation, and we'll try to get through them as quickly as we can. So thank you very much, and John and Melissa.
Okay.
Good, thanks.
Mr. McNamara, welcome back.
Mayor and Council, it's good to be here. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us tonight. I think we're in a good spot with our presentation and recommendations from staff. You told me it was.
I know, I jinxed us.
It's going on this side, but not over there. How you giving a whirl for us, John?
All
There we
right,
go.
here we are.
Thank you.
So real quick, where we're at tonight is we really want to make sure that we get back to council, based on the feedback that we got at the last meeting. And so really, we're moving towards recommendations versus ideas and stuff that the group has talked about. So we'd like to get some feedback on that. Really talk through what needs and priorities the team has come up with, talk a little bit about budget and recommendations, and then really kind of circle back with next steps. I think we're at conclusion of the study. From an organizational side of things, we are in task 7, which is looking to and seeking approval from council on what the team has been doing and kind of what the next steps are. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. But quickly jumping into recommendations, we really have broken it down, in a couple of different ways, looking at departments and then kind of looking at the projects themselves. And so looking at the recommendations for the fire department is really kind of looking at, how do we want fire to operate long-term? And will the existing facility function adequately for that long-term vision? And I think the conclusion to that is it'll be very difficult to achieve that with the current site. And so our phase 1 recommendation is really to start looking at a land purchase to look at a future station. And in the phase 2 portion of that, really look at building that central station, which then allows some opportunities for the existing building for some repurposing, which we'll talk about tonight. For Public Works, this is kind of tied to a couple of other facilities that you have, but in the short term, we're really looking at office additions and renovations to the building, dealing with some of the deficiencies related to locker spaces, office space, and basically have enough space for the team to meet in that facility. And then the phase 2, depending upon some discussions around the fire station and our downtown Public Works facility, really looking at consolidating storage for Public Works in one location. And as you know, that site is set up for that. It's just a matter of the timing of when we want to go about doing that. And then really out in phase 3 are improvements to City Hall and the Rec Center, and I think those are pretty standalone. Some of it does talk to what do you do with this facility long-term, and I think we're all in agreement that there is space in this building, but that's kind of tied to the library and what might occur with that. And we have some good ideas on how we might be able to improve programs at the community center without making major changes to that building. And we don't have anything in the recommendation short-term for the building right now.
Mr. McNamara, on the phase 1, 2, and 3, can you give us a little bit of a timeline? Is phase 1 within a year, within 5 years? What's your?
Yeah, we're looking short-term as basically starting now, start looking for some of that land, and midterm is in that, 5 to, probably 5 years, thinking about what we've been talking about with the group. That midterm is, in that 5 to 10 years, and then long-term is going to be, 10 to 15 years, depending upon what we see happening in the city long-term. Does that help?
Yep, thank you.
Well, there's my short-term, midterm, long-term. I guess I should put some dates on those for you, but in the short term, we are suggesting, again, that land acquisition We are suggesting some renovation in that building would be appropriate. There is that mezzanine space in there. That would be great to put some office space in there. It would not only free up space for the engineering department, but would also allow for some staff space on the main level. Midterm, looking at constructing that new fire station, and then long-term, looking at expansion of City Hall into the library space, and then building a new library, and then doing some renovations at the rec center. From a departmental history, certainly the fire station has seen some changes over the years, but they've been mostly cosmetic changes to the building. There hasn't really been much in the way of operational changes other than some of the stuff over near where the engineering department is. So we really need to look at operationally, can that building support what we want it to do? And I think the answer to that is it would be very difficult from a site perspective and from a renovation side of things to really get that building to work in a way that we would want it to. And then it would really limit any changes related to engineering, public works, or the water treatment facility that's connected to it. It's very landlocked in that location there. And as you look at the changes in staffing models, so, as the city grows and continues to change, there's going to be a need for duty crew space in there. There's going to be a need for sleeping space, and it's just going to be really difficult to put that in that facility. We know that firefighter health and wellness is an important piece that we need to be considering. They have obviously operational things in place right now that deal with some of that, but to really deal with it long-term, we need space in order to do that. We need decontamination space, we need proper space for fire gear in there, we need wash space, and we need space for firefighters to be able to change out and effectively do that in an area that's outside of the living space. Yes, ma'am.
Is that what you're wanting to do with the current fire station or the new one?
The new station is
Okay.
probably a better answer for it. I think the amount of work that we would have to do to the existing station would limit apparatus space and other things in that facility, which I don't think is something that we want to do right now.
Okay, thank you.
The lobby, there really isn't much of a lobby in there, and so as people come into the building, there isn't really space in there for a public member to come in and either meet with a firefighter, get a blood pressure check, medical check, or whatever it might be. And so we would need to make some changes in that area, which would then again compromise some of the staff spaces that are in there. And as I said, there really isn't any space in there for a duty crew, or effectively right now, all of the officers share space in that building. There really isn't a good space for the fire chief separate from other staff spaces that are within the building. So our recommendations is that, given all of that information, is that the station, while it's something that is a great city asset, it really isn't a good facility for the fire department long-term. The site's not large enough, and the existing building is going to be a challenge to adapt to the changing needs of the department. So what we're recommending is that we do some short-term changes in that building that handle some of the operational things, but long-term, we program out and budget for, in the city budget, for a new station in the future. I have included the site diagram because I know there were questions at the last council meeting as far as space on that site. The site is bound on all sides of there, and there are some grade differences in there that would make it challenging to make the modifications needed to the building in the areas that we want to. So what we're recommending for the upper level of the facility is to continue to use part of that space for the fitness program for the fire department, but create some flexible office space in that area, some workstations, a couple of offices, some collaboration area. Right now it's being used for some of that stuff, but it's somewhat disorganized up there, and getting a little bit of organization up there and really kind of fixing it up would be worth doing because it would allow for some additional staff space in that area as well. One of the things as you talk about the land purchases is where do we put a station, and I know the fire chief has some information related to that he can share.
Yeah. Good evening, Mayor and Council. So the next two slides that you'll see are some GIS data analysis that we have run just to show you what the reach, when I talk about response times, could be related to some general areas. So again, we're not honing in on a specific site. This is just what we're saying. We could from a general area of the city, this is what we cover. So on this map, you'll see the red dashed line, which is our ultimate city boundary. So once this city is completely built out, all the annexation is complete, that'll be our ultimate city limits. Everything shaded in pink is something that we could reach within an 8.5-minute drive time. And if we follow the kind of the NFPA recommended standard, factoring in a 1.5-minute turnout time, so the time it takes for firefighters to get gear on and depart the station, ultimately this concludes to a 10-minute total response time. And as you can see through that map, we can cover the vast majority of that ultimate city boundary in that 10 minutes or less. There's one very small exception in the southwest, the very far southwest corner of the ultimate city limits. And again, this is based on today's roads. So as roads continue to improve and get built out, we know in the township area today, a lot of the roads are smaller gravel roads and don't necessarily allow for travel, easier to different portions of the city. So as those roads get built out and continue to evolve, this should improve. So again, this is just one site, and again, one general area, and that would be our reach. If you go on to the next slide, again, just another general area that we ran, this would shift most of our response time to the east, and we sacrifice some of that reach on the little bit of the west end and then also the northwest corner. So again, just kind of giving you some perspective that we can cover the vast majority of that ultimate city boundary in 10 minutes or less. The caveat to that is the staffing model would have to change at some point as well. And not saying we need to transition to a full-time fire department, but start staffing some more duty crew shifts so that we ensure we've got people at the station to provide this coverage.
Okay.
So that kind of leads into kind of that midterm recommendations, which is to design a station that meets the city's needs long-term. And so we spent some time programming the size of that station so we have a good idea as far as the size of the facility, which then also allows, as you look at land, to make sure that there's adequate space for that station at the time that we're ready to go about doing that. Certainly the station design should allow for that transition that the chief is talking about. So as we design a station like that, we want to build in space that it can be either used for a duty crew or converted into sleeping space as we look to the future, so that you're not building a station in, say, 5 years that doesn't meet the city's needs long-term and you're in the same situation that you are in right now. And then the phase 3 recommendation, which leads us into our conversation related to public works, is to repurpose that facility for storage, for engineering, for public works staff. It's a great location. It's got a nice garage in it. It has the space that would be, that we could use for that, which would allow for you to defer when you need to build an addition onto the existing public works facility, or what you might decide to do with the downtown site. So at this point in time, as we start to look at public works, we're not recommending that addition onto the building right now, nor are we recommending to move away from using the downtown facility, because once you trigger that idea of, okay, we're going to do something different with the current downtown public works site, that triggers that storage need that we don't want to occur until we have space available for that, either at the public works facility or out at the current public works site. So as you look at cost for the fire department for that phase 1 solution, we are suggesting you set aside some money for site purchase. We have a placeholder in there right now because there isn't a site specific for that yet, but we're recommending that we put a budget together for that. The interior renovations, we think that 1,900 square feet could use some mechanical improvements, some walls, doors, furniture, all of that type of stuff. And so we have a budget of about $370,000 to do that initial renovation. Our phase 2 recommendation for the new fire facility is that the city should be looking to budget about 11 million for that. And you can see in that disclaimer at the bottom, we are projecting 2024 dollars for that. So that is, you know, in that 3 to 5 year range as you're thinking about that. That is to start putting that together in that time frame. So as we transition to public works, what we know is what I kind of shared earlier is that space is limited for staff in there. The locker space is inadequate for gender diversity in there. We talked a lot about this during COVID, that there just really isn't space in there for any sort of social distancing in there. But just in general, even without that, there's not enough room for the teams to meet and have meals or meetings or training in the one singular space that's in that building for that. And so what we're really looking for this facility is that there's really no growth space built into it. It's really all about, you know, the addition on it, but can we defer the big addition but yet still provide some of that space for staff that we need? And so as we think about the capacity of that building, what we're really looking for is if we leave our equipment where it is, we probably have enough room in that current building. There really isn't a lot of space to add any additional equipment, but if the other facilities that are storing equipment right now stay as they are, we can probably get by in the short term with an addition onto the building that allows for that staff space and training space that we need to have in that building. So the short-term recommendation is really to do a small addition onto that building that provides that additional office space. And right now we've targeted an addition right off the current administration area. We're not targeting the north side of the building just because that's where the vehicle storage space would go. In the original planning of that building, it kind of envisioned doubling the size of that building with some space inside there, but from a practical side of things, it's probably easier and more cost-effective to do a small addition on the front side that would be for that meeting space, training space, and that type of stuff, and office space, and then that would allow us to renovate the existing locker areas and staff area to provide those things in there that are missing right now. So a pretty straightforward addition onto that building. Midterm, we really need to start thinking about our equipment storage. So that's the component of, we have stuff that's in the downtown garage, we have other things that are being stored in other locations. When is it appropriate to build that space onto it? And so we right now have in the midterm doing that building addition on there to that building. It requires some additional things on the site, moving some of the storage bins, some of that, but the site is prepped for that. So certainly that's one of the things that we should be looking at. If we take on the construction of a new fire station in that midterm, you could then at the same time start utilizing the existing fire station with some, you know, minor changes to it for some of that public works storage, which would give the city some options related to either, you know, discontinuing use of the old public works site or, you know, potentially deferring when this addition might occur on this building. And so there's a few moving parts with that one, but I think the messaging is at some point in time, we need to start budgeting for an addition to that building that then takes all of the city's needs basically under one roof at one facility. And so that addition would basically double the size of the building. We would need to relocate a couple of things on site, but those are fairly easy to do. But that would effectively double the size of the storage in that one location there. For the short term, for the addition, we've got about 900 square feet we'd be adding on to the building, some 1,100 square feet of renovation. So we have a budget of around $550,000 to do that work in the short term. Midterm would add that 16,000 square foot addition on there. And again, we've inflated that to the timeline of that 2024 timeline. So our numbers for that is about $4.5 million to add on to that building and make the necessary changes to the site. And then our long-term recommendations, we know that some additional space would be nice at the rec center. We're doing some small little minor things right now in the building for lockers and stuff like that, but at some point in time, there's some need for some office space. It would be great to centralize administration and check-in at one location in the building and kind of clean some of that stuff up. So we envisioned a small addition onto the building, kind of repurposing some spaces, adding some meeting room spaces to the building, but a pretty straightforward addition and renovation to the building. Long-term for City Hall, as the city continues to grow and change, you're gonna need additional space in here. I know we've talked about, could we change how the city is laid out as far as where the customer experiences and some of that. And that really would involve relocation of the library to a different location. We've talked about a couple of locations for it, but again, that's far enough out that, we probably don't need to, get too far into detail on where that would occur. It's just understanding that, we would need to work on building a library at some location, which would then allow renovation in this building to occur at that point in time. And so there's a little bit of a domino effect as you start to look at City Hall, library, and rec center, and some of the decisions related to the rec center on, where we put additions and renovations to the building, our future discussions that we can have related to long-term usability of that site. So for our recommendations for that, we didn't target this in a year because it is a bit of a floating target as far as when those things would need to occur. So we've put all of the dollars in here in current 2022 dollars and would suggest, an inflationary factor be added to it to whatever year it fits best into the CIP, but we have about 1.9 million allocated for additions and renovations to the rec center, and about $750,000 for renovations to this building, and about $4 million slated for a library. And certainly with that, conversations with the county would be needed in order to kind of finalize layout and size, but we just took a 10,000 square foot number for that at this point in time. So next steps, obviously we're here today entertaining some conversation with council, but we really would like to get to the point where we publish a kind of final recommendations and have council adopt the space needs study, and then potentially look at how you want to proceed with some of those earlier recommendations. So,
Terrific.
that, Mayor, Council?
Thank you.
Love any questions?
Ms. Hardy, yes.
Mayor, Council, before you get into discussion or asking any questions, I think Chief Hager has just one additional piece of information to share with you, and I think he might be ready to do that now.
Chief?
I will try here quickly. All right, good evening again, Mayor, Council. So unfortunately, we weren't able to include this in the presentation because it's kind of an interactive display. But again, just looking at really helping drive that decision to ultimately move that staffing model. What you'll see now, again, that red line is our ultimate city boundary. Everything shaded in purple is an 8-minute reach from our existing facility, so the current fire station today. And I use that 8-minute number based on some direction at a workshop last fall that we had some conversations about what was our targeted response time. So in an ideal world, we've got a crew sitting at the station. They leave the instant a call is received. This is our reach within 8 minutes. If we factor in our average turnout time in 2020, so that's the time it takes to get our people from home, work, to the fire station, assembled, and out the door, which was just over 5 minutes, our reach goes down to that. So that turnout time is really what's reducing that response time. So we just wanted to share that this was, another consideration that we're reviewing and looking at in part of all this conversation about the facility.
Okay. Thank you, Chief.
Thanks.
All right, council. Anything else from staff before we go to questions? Council, questions?
I just have one, clarification.
Roberts.
I believe, so if we were to build a new fire station in the midterm, right, 5 years-ish, let's just say, that would then push, right, and then we repurposed the current fire station, that would push the need for doubling the public works site in the midterm, correct? That was just, or would that still be midterm? Because you had it in the midterm, but
It floats in the midterm, depending upon decisions related to perhaps the downtown public works site. At some point, you're going to grow to the point where you're gonna need the addition onto the Public Works building regardless
Sure.
of, so I believe, and you can answer that question, we don't have room in the building to add yet another piece of equipment in there, is where we're at right now.
Mr. Schilder,
Yeah,
got
real
some
quick, I'll just add
color
a
to
bit
that?
So if we were to repurpose the current fire station into a public works facility, if we did not change the way we were using the old shop, the downtown facility right now, that would be an add of square footage. So we'd be adding 7,000 square feet, roughly about that, to our inventory of space that we can use for public works. So yes, that would delay the need for the addition on the current shop on Bavaria Road. However, if council decided that they wanted to repurpose the old shop into something else, then that becomes neutral, net neutral. So we wouldn't be gaining anything by adding that position at the former fire station. We'd be in the same position we are now, which does not allow for us to grow. So the need would then continue to be the addition on our Bavaria Road location.
Okay, that's interesting. So moving everything from downtown, the downtown space, to the public works space is a neutral.
Yes, if we moved it to the fire station, they're very similar in
So,
footprint. So
okay, got it. Oh, that's interesting.
Is that just in terms of storage space for equipment or for offices?
So office space.
'cause
so
there's
the
no-
short-term needs identified in the presentation. The addition of those office spaces in that mezzanine or that upper level above the newer bays in the fire station would allow for some space for city staff, whether it's our building department, engineering, possibly IT, things like that. That's going to be a good location for that, as well in the very short term for some possibly extra administrative offices for some fire department needs. So that would kind of loosen up the space in Andrew's, or Chief Hager's office, providing us some room to grow up there at the same time, so giving us some flexibility. It would also, of course, there would be an additional space added for some break room for, if it were determined that it was going to become a public works facility, the training room in Chief Hager's office currently, where it's located, would certainly be able to be used by, I envision, possibly our utilities department, things like that. So it would free up some space for growth at our Bavaria Road shop, our public works shop as it is now. But again, the space doesn't change with the storage, the facility storage. So
From a pure storage play, it's net neutral, but there is additional value in
Yes.
structuring the offices in that second
Yes,
tier.
there would be a lot to gain in that, and there's a lot of flexibility that can be had with that space as well, depending on what council decided was the direction. If we had another public safety need, I mean, there's certainly room to be, it's very flexible for usage. I mean, it allows us to, a lot of opportunity for changes and growth within the city.
A couple of questions. So I want to write this down so I don't forget it. One of the things that we had talked about before was that there was value in having some of the equipment that we use downtown located closer to downtown.
Yeah.
And now we're kind of pushing that back outside of downtown, or at least in the long term.
I think that if you were to ask what my ask was, it would be that we would still maintain a small storage facility in that location, not the size that we have now currently, that 7,000 square feet is not necessary for what we need for our downtown operations. If we were still able to maintain that property, if that were to happen, my hope and desire would be that we would find a way to either use the two-car garage that's down there right now for the, maintaining the small amount of equipment we need down there, or if there needed to be an addition, or that 1,100 square foot structure that we had at one point talked about building out there might fall into play.
Is that two-car garage thing big
Sufficient.
enough? Yeah,
I think it
sufficient.
could be. Seasonally, we could make it work, absolutely.
Okay.
And it's a building that we own. It's a facility that is certainly usable. It could certainly work.
So you had also hinted about public safety. So with our sheriff's contract, we do have to provide an office for, where does that go? Does that stay out at Public Works? Is that the intention?
I think
Or,
currently.
I'm sorry, out at,
The water treatment plant?
yes, thank you.
So I think as I understand the contract to be written, I believe that we have an obligation to offer them
Mm-hmm.
office space. And I think beyond that, I think that it's up to our interpretation and the way we want to use it. So we do have a room that they have been using. It seems to work well for them currently. And I think that as it is right now, we could certainly continue to do that. However, with those that flex space that we talked about building out on the mezzanine, maybe that would be in a more appropriate place as well, giving us even additional office space and square footage for potentially, as I mentioned, the IT director that's coming, that may be hired at some point or something like that. So as long as we have space for them, I think that's what's important. But yes, again, that flexibility is what's great here, is the ability to kind of have options and opportunity to change, and possibly, yes, maybe that training room area that is currently in the fire station might be able to be used for something like that. It's certainly, we're happy to look at all recommendations for that.
One of the other questions that I have for you, because the water treatment plant is located out there, we're bought into that, right? So there's that whole part in the second, where the fire station is currently, that if we're going to use it for public works in the short term, that might be me. And we want to, use it for public works in the short term, what takes care of it in the long term? Or what do we do with that part of it in the long term? Can we use it for more water treatment purposes?
I think so. The water treatment plant itself and the facility that is used as a water treatment plant is engineered and designed to be what it is, and it would be, I can't even imagine what it would take to convert the rest of it to an additional water treatment plant. It might be not practical or necessary in that location anyway. However, I think as I'm envisioning the way our operations work and will continue to work into the future, I believe that kind of as our community grows, it's not, I think it would be a fine idea to have our utilities department working out of that, because our utilities, both water and sewer, is kind of a vertical that could easily be shifted to that location, and we could really run all of their work out of that entire facility instead of having them reporting to the other shop. We could have our parks and our streets and storm out of the other shop and have our utilities out of what would then be a repurposed fire station. So I think it would work well. It could be there'd be good, I think it would be a fine idea.
Synergy.
Yes, it would be very synergy.
Okay.
Good synergy.
Questions? Councilmember Roberts.
For the old Public Works building, I know we've talked about, about prettying it up a little bit, right? Like, I guess what's the cost in, is that building falling apart, right? Like, to make sure that if we don't want that net neutral, if we move to, it's stuff to the old fire station, if we wanted to keep that so that we had some presence down here still, what do we have to do to that to make sure it's going to last for a while?
I don't personally have those numbers. I don't have any idea. I know structurally the building is up and it works as it is. Okay. Certainly there should be and could be.
Paint job.
There could be something as simple as a paint job that could make things a lot
But there's like
prettier.
roofing
However,
or like stuff like that, right?
We maintain the roof as it is. We are always doing the work out there to make sure that it gets inspected every year, and we make sure that we are keeping up with the maintenance needs and things like that. So structurally, I believe that the bones of it are intact, and it's certainly it is what it's a tin. It's a tin shed.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to make sure that we weren't, no, but
But there isn't any reason for me to believe that it is in imminent danger of falling down or anything like that. I haven't.
And it suits the purpose for what's.
It's currently, the consideration has been, and I think that there has been recommendations or discussion anyway, that, that spot be repurposed as many different things. And one of them I've heard kicked around is maybe pickleball courts, or maybe just a trailhead, or maybe lots of different things that could be used, parking spot. There's a lot of things that we have used it for, continue to use it for, and likely would like to be able to continue to use it for, even our compost site, things like that. I think it works well for that. It's a good location to keep people in a central place where it's easy to get to. So there's a lot of good use and value to that property. It just depends on what your vision is as well and how you'd like to see that used. And that kind of just triggers the rest of everything else with the public works. So
Terrific. Thank you.
it feels like it's more of we're talking midterm, right? So if if we're building, we have to wait till we build the new fire station anyway. So at that point, then, whether it's us or other people
Right,
get
and
to
it's
decide what
First we need to
happens
buy some
with their-
property.
Yes.
right, first things first, and that's kind of, I believe, I don't want to speak out of turn here, but as we were developing the staff recommendations for this, coming to the finding that I think the term is linchpin to decide what triggered everything else. And we recognized after some discussion and quite a bit of research that the fire station was what did that for us. And everything else kind of hinged on that. So that kind of really determines the next steps and the progression and the timing for the rest of the space needs assessment and where we move forward. So I will encourage us, of course, to keep it in mind that, you know, yes, the fire station is certainly first in my mind in how we move forward, but, you know, planning for funding for that addition on the public works building would be probably a smart thing to follow it up with and understand where we're going to be going, especially with the old building and how we determine what you determine is best to move forward with that.
Yeah, thanks.
And just one more question.
Yes,
Sorry.
of course.
So we talked about like a lot of the issues that the fire department currently has, right? So if we do go forward with the plan to build a new fire station in 5 years, the remodel or the additions that we do will take care for the most part. Like you're concerned. I mean, we want to obviously make sure you guys have the facilities, and like this isn't something that needs to be expedited, I guess, right? So I just want to make sure you guys have what you need to do what you do.
Chief.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. That's a great question. I think we've made all the operational changes that we can to impact those health and safety hazards, given the confines of the existing facility. As John mentioned, without some significant changes and investment in the structure of the facility itself, we won't be able to achieve them all. So it's, you know, weighing that, do we put a bunch of money into an old building, you get a couple years out of it, or we keep looking for ways to refine our operations to help get us to that point. So I think, you know, where we're at today, like I said, we're constantly tweaking those to make sure we're doing what's best for our folks, given the confines of that facility, and we'll work through that.
Other questions?
No, I just think that this is a prudent outline, and, you know, it'll get tweaked as we go along, and I think it's a good start.
That's a question I have. It's more around the process of what we're approving. So if we approve this as is, are we saying that we approve the plan and we start building the budget accordingly to execute those plans? Or are we just saying, okay, we like the structure of this plan, it makes sense, but we're not sure where the money's gonna come from yet? What are we,
Ms. Hardy.
Where's the money?
Thank you.
show me the money.
Yes, the key question. Excellent question. Thank you for bringing that up. And yes, so we don't actually have the plan in front of you today. So part of what we're looking for from you today is just, how do you feel about this plan? So how do you feel about these recommendations? And if the consensus and the majority of the council says this sounds like a good plan, we will bring a formal facility space needs plan to you for formal adoption. That actually kicks off our process on the staff side, where we've got a plan that's going to guide some of the decision-making for us in the future, where we can continue to bring back periodic discussions to council and future councils. And so that, as this is, you know, this plan would encompass the next 10, 15 plus years. And if you are not sitting in these chairs and someone else is sitting in the chairs, they have the history and those guiding principles and documents in front of them. And to answer your question about where's the money, that would be, once you give us the direction, that would be something that we would start looking for in preliminary, in a very preliminary high level. We've started at least looking at the possibilities as we were looking at what needs to fall in short-term, mid-term, long-term, and what resources do we have, or how can we get there. We've started to look at those things. We've not spent a lot of time on that because, of course, we haven't gotten official direction from you all. But once that happens, we would begin that work, incorporate any future recommendations. If we get direction from you tonight, we could feasibly bring information back as part of this year's budget discussions to just at least let you know what path or what options we have available to us.
So it seems like the start is, if we want to start looking for land, and is that something we can, if we're comfortable, we can say tonight, start looking for land for the
Yes.
new fire department? I would be in favor of that. I don't know if however others feel.
You know, I agree. I love where you're going with this. I think we talked about 2 fire stations versus 1 fire station, and where does this thing get located, and how do we get the best response times from wherever we're located? I love the idea of 1 fire station. I just think it makes way more sense to have everything under one roof. I love what you're doing with the mezzanine to make that space more useful. We know it's not used to its extent that it could be right now, so I think that works great for me. I like the idea of you know, giving Public Works a place to go as well, until we can get their addition built on. Public Works needs to have an addition sooner rather than later, just to operate their functional space out there. They need locker rooms, and if you guys have ever been there, they're sitting on each other's laps out there. So we need to get some space for Public Works. So I am in favor of adopting this space needs plan and kicking off the process to get it moving. And am I seeing that? And I've seen nods all the way around. All right, terrific. So, Ms. Hardy, you got what you need. Mr. Shoger, Chief, good to go. Terrific. With that, thank you, Mr. McNamara.
you.
It's a pleasure to see you. And Ms. Stein sitting behind you. Good to see you as well. Thank you for your good work on that.
Thank you.
And if there's no further discussion, we will adjourn our meeting. Can I have a motion?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Motion carries. We are adjourned. We will be back shortly to commence